Chapter 2. Chapter 2. I'm sorry, the name doesn't ring a bell, Obi-Wan said, his expression still dry and what Luke suspected was deceptively mild. Continue to deny it, the Inquisitor scoffed, but even if there were anyone in the galaxy that didn't know the name Luke Skywalker, I heard you and your men yelling for Skywalker during the fight. Yeah, no, a new voice came as the door opened. They were calling for me. And standing in the doorway was the other human Jedi from the fight, young, blonde, and cocky, with a force presence stronger than any Luke had ever felt, except for one. And you are? Mara drawled, eyebrow raised. She sounded carelessly disdainful, but Luke was pretty sure he saw the corner of her mouth tighten a hint more than usual. Which made sense given that, from what she had said, Mara hadn't exactly been friendly with Vader back when she had been the Emperor's personal spy and assassin. Not that anyone had been friendly with Vader, ever, except, of course, back when he'd felt like this in the Force. Time travel was hard to believe, yes, and Luke hadn't been sure. But the second his father walked in, the second he felt those two the shining, familiar Force presences, combined with the way the season and vegetation around the old Sith temple where he'd been held had suddenly changed, not to mention Mara's ship disappearing from behind them. Luke found himself willing to believe that it had actually happened. General Anakin Skywalker. And you are? Darth Vection. But you can call me my lord. Oh, great, another one, said the last Jedi occupant of the room, judging by the lightsaber at her belt, a teenage Togruta who had trailed in behind his father. Between the three Jedi, the two armored soldiers, and the four cells, it was starting to get crowded. One of the soldiers, the one with blue decorating his unnervingly stormtrooper-esque armor, scoffed at almost the exact same moment. Yeah, over a whole mound of dead bodies. That can be arranged. If you're done posturing, Vection, Obi-Wan said. His emphasis on the title suggested he did not exactly take it seriously. I don't suppose you have a name we might actually find in a database? Some sort of documentation of your position in the Separatist military, perhaps. What? So you can look up all my history? Mara smirked. Not that knowing will help you at all, seeing as I haven't been born yet. Several baffled looks were directed at Mara. Luke was amused to see that even the tilted helmets of the soldiers looked utterly confused and utterly unimpressed. Oh, really now? Obi-Wan asked after a moment. Yeah, Valen said sharply. Question seconded. Before Mara could answer, the Inquisitor started chuckling. General Obi-Wan Kenobi, one of the most wanted enemies of the Empire for almost 2 decades. So, Vection, you're telling me you think this isn't some pathetically transparent gambit by the New Republic? It's not a gambit, Luke cut in. Much as he enjoyed watching Mara at work, so entirely in her element, I felt their Force signatures during our battle. I knew Obi-Wan Kenobi. That's his Force signature, and the man standing next to him has the Force signature of my father. All I snapped to Luke. Excuse me? The future Darth Vader demanded. That's right, Luke said quietly, his voice echoing in the utter silence despite it. I'm your son from the future. Anakin scoffed. Ha, right. And say for just 1 second that I believe you. Why, exactly, would my son be bowing before a Sith Lord? Luke managed, somehow, to keep himself from reacting to that mound of irony. Because I am one, right, and that definitely makes me more likely to believe your claims. Luke shrugged. Believe what you want, but Lord Vection is my master. The expression he'd forced onto his face bordered on fanatic. I think you Jedi aren't really appreciating the gravity of that. Valen cut in, a nasty, gloating smile on her face. That's the master of the Jedi Order, swearing loyalty to the Sith. Of course, you're already doomed to die out, but for those of us who already knew that, this is really quite the show. Obi-Wan turned to one of the soldiers. Cody, why don't you go send word that we'll be returning to the temple, in light of recent developments? The yellow-accented soldier nodded and left, with what Luke was pretty sure was a snort. So, Obi-Wan turned back to Luke. You're Anakin's son, the master of the Jedi Order, supposedly, after we've all died, or some such. And in this scenario, you've fallen to the dark side because, well, Luke hadn't exactly thought that convincing the Jedi he was Anakin Skywalker's recently turned Sith son from the future would be easy. Lord Vection showed me the error of my ways, Luke intoned. She showed me the power of the dark side, the ecstasy of surrendering to it, and to her, he's quite the loyal disciple, Mara drawled. It took him a while, of course. But he's broken in now, aren't you, my dear? Yes, master, I am whatever you want me to be. Broken in? Obi-Wan asked, brow raised and tone dubious. Everyone knows the fastest way to turn a Jedi is to torture them into it, and I'm better at it than anyone alive. With a scoff, Anakin said, yeah, if you really tortured him into it, I bet he's gonna turn around and kill you the second he gets the chance. I would never, Luke bit out, which was in fact true. Lord Vection showed me the truth, showed me how pathetic my efforts to be a Jedi, to serve the common people, truly were. Now I know that my true purpose in life is to serve her. Luke was pretty sure the Inquisitor was restraining himself from adding dramatic sound effects. Well, Obi-Wan said after a moment of silence, I suppose we shall see. Luke had been undercover as a tortured captive for 10 days, having to act like he was gradually growing darker and darker, restrained and pretending to be force-blind and beaten in the bowels of a Sith temple. 10 days without any kindness except from Mara, and all their interactions measured against the likelihood that someone was watching. She hadn't let anyone else touch him, but he'd still had to endure the taunts and degradations, the graphic descriptions of how, exactly, the children he was trying to save would be tortured. And now, he had to pretend to be a Sith himself, to want to hurt people, had to lie to Obi-Wan, had to fool his father, had to deceive all of the Jedi, had to pretend to be what he'd thrown down his lightsaber and sworn never to become. He couldn't escape that. And he'd lost even the ability to talk to Mara about how much he was struggling. Maybe, just maybe, being transferred from the brig on the ship and into the holding cells at the temple would give him the chance. Well, there was always hope, but Luke wasn't optimistic. And in the meantime, Coruscant was still hours away. As Luke had feared, their arrival on Coruscant left with him no privacy at all, much less privacy with Mara. Instead he was curtly and efficiently escorted to a complex of cells in the depths of the Jedi Temple. Escorted in through a back way, probably to minimize what they could see and how much they could be seen, but even what little there was. Luke had to remind himself to breathe as they walked through the temple, as he saw its halls whole, unsinged, standing, occupied. He could feel the Force signatures of thousands of Jedi, even as muffled as his own Force sense was by his efforts to hold it inside of himself. Even at the height of the Praxium, he had considered a couple hundred students an amazing achievement. And those students had mostly been new learners, amazing and awe-inspiring in their very existence, but still far removed from the controlled and coherent presences around him. Shaped into focus by decades of training, he wished he could let his shields drop and simply revel in the feeling of so many Force sensitives, thriving, alive. And if this is what they felt like in the middle of a war, but he couldn't do anything that might reveal him to the Inquisitor and Valen, marched behind him and beside him, respectively. He couldn't let a genuine, non-malicious grin show, couldn't turn to Mara and share his wonder. Mara couldn't even feel this. Luke was fighting off tears at the fullness of the Force around him, but Mara was still trapped by the actual, working Force binders that Ben Obi-Wan and his father had brought. To her Force sense, the entire galaxy might as well be dead. The cascade of emotions kept Luke occupied through his trip the rest of the way to the cell, to the arguments between the Jedi and Mara, Valen, and the Inquisitor about whether they really were from the future, about whether any evidence could be produced. Even when his arm and his DNA were drafted into this effort, Luke barely reacted. The cover story they told would have to excuse him being a bit of out of, because all he could do was sit there and revel as discreetly as he could in the Force sense of a living Obi-Wan Kenobi. Of an Anakin Skywalker not yet tainted by the dark. All he could do was sit there, and wish he could do more. A son, Obi-Wan hissed as soon as the results of the DNA match came in. But his hiss was still loud enough to echo through the private room of the temple's medical ward. Really, Anakin? A child? Ahsoka's eyes had grown to take up half her face, and all she managed was a somewhat strangled, "Master, explain yourself. You will." Knight Skywalker. Neither Yoda nor Mace looked happy with him. "I have no idea how this happened," Anakin snapped. "Look, if he's from the future, he could be born decades from now. I didn't intend to break the code in the future, and I'm certainly not breaking it now." Obi-Wan sighed. "Well, between the DNA results and Luke Skywalker's decidedly advanced prosthetic, I suppose we at least have solid evidence that they are from the future." No one seemed to consider this sufficient compensation for Anakin's apparent child. It took another 45 minutes of arguing, and what Anakin considered to be some of the best and most desperate acting of his life. But finally Master Yoda and Master Windu had decided to believe him. Obi-Wan had, kind of defended him, though Ahsoka had just looked torn between laughter and vague bewilderment. And though Yoda and Windu had threatened to keep him under watch, they had very reluctantly agreed they couldn't punish him for something that hadn't yet happened, especially when this incident might persuade him to take different actions in the future. Anakin had to admit, the thought of what he had spoken to down in the temple holding cells, the disdainful face he'd seen slammed behind cell bars. Finding out he had a son who became a Sith was very good incentive to double-check his birth control. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe the change he needed to make was to ensure that his son was never, ever in the position to be corrupted by the Sith. If Luke had been sucked back in time just 2 weeks earlier, Anakin could have met his son, his actual son, not this corrupted fragment of darkness that had replaced him. But he couldn't think about that. It was he just couldn't. Besides, Obi-Wan was still skeptical of Anakin's word that he wasn't already attached to someone, in a potentially child-producing way. And he couldn't risk Obi-Wan saying anything to the council. He couldn't. Anakin Skywalker's eyes stayed intently fixed on Luke's own as the seconds passed. His stare was as intense as Luke had ever seen, and far more intense than he'd ever seen from Vader, given the man's mask. The weight of Vader's regard had been terrifying on Bespin and no easy thing at Endor. The weight of Anakin Skywalker's regard was easily less than that, but it was still palpable. So, Anakin finally said, voice firm and steady. He held himself completely still, but Luke had the contradictory impression that his father could explode into motion and tension at any second. How did all this happen? Despite the words, it did not sound like a question. And thus Luke was left in the position of having to pretend to be evil while talking to a version of his father that wasn't evil yet. He had been doing that over the course of the previous day, during their imprisonment on the Jedi ship and the battle before it, but one-on-one, that was worse. At least it wasn't as painful as having to pretend to be evil to Ben. Lord Vection showed me the power of the dark side, Luke said. If his voice was a bit lower than normal, that was because he was basically doing a Darth Vader impression, minus the breathing and the aesthetic and the murdering people. Although they had let him keep his clothes after a very thorough pat-down, meaning he was still wearing the all-black outfit that served as his customary alternative to robes. So, a little of the aesthetic. You mean when she was torturing you? Anakin once again did not ask, his fist clenched on the interrogation room table. The pain was worth it, to see the true weakness of the light, Luke riffed, trying to keep his face as even as possible. Whatever example the Inquisitor had set, Vader and the Emperor had not been known for their expressiveness, and he really didn't think cackling was his strongest move. Anakin just scoffed. It's the dark side that's weak. The only people who give into it are stupid and desperate and evil. Luke wasn't quite sure what to do with that amount of concentrated irony. So instead, he raised a pointed eyebrow and said, "You think I'm weak and stupid?" Anakin's face contorted. "I didn't know. I think you were desperate." "Understandably, after that waste of sentient life tortured you," said the man who had cut off his hand, however much Luke had made peace with their encounters. "And I'm better for it. I've embraced my destiny." With a snort, Anakin responded, "Yeah, destiny's not all it's cracked up to be." What that was about, Luke had no idea. He and Mara hadn't had the chance to discuss this, to discuss anything, or, well, she'd discussed things with him, but he hadn't been able to say anything back. They were trapped in the past. Somehow, they had to get back. Somehow they had kidnapped children to save. But while Luke could keep playing evil, could bide his time until they got a location out of the bounty hunter and the Inquisitor. Rescuing the children wasn't the only thing he might be able to accomplish. He needed to save the 34 sensitive children kidnapped from his own Praxium. No matter what, he wouldn't give up on them if there was even the slightest chance that he and Mara could get back to their own time. He had to keep trying to get a location. He couldn't abandon any innocent children, but much less ones that had been under his protection. But if he and Mara were very smart and very, very careful about it, they might be able to save the whole galaxy too, by pretending to want to conquer it. "Maybe your destiny wasn't," Luke returned in as portentous a voice as he could manage, "but mine will be, and I will lay the galaxy at the feet of my Empress." Anakin's only response was a look of pain and disgust. It was easy to see the echoes of Darth Vader in Anakin Skywalker. Too easy for anyone who knew his future to be comfortable with the parallels. Or, at least, too easy for Mara Jade to be comfortable with the parallels she didn't know for sure, since she couldn't fucking ask him. But Mara strongly suspected that Luke was better than managing. At least with that part of it all. With the having to pretend he was a Sith while meeting his father and Obi-Wan Kenobi part, probably not so much. Mara wasn't Luke, though. She didn't have his personal attachment to Darth Vader, nor his seemingly endless capacity for forgiveness, even for people who probably didn't deserve it. That said, For all Mara lacked Luke's personal attachment to Darth Vader, she'd also known him much longer. Not necessarily better, given the question of whether anyone but the Emperor actually knew Darth Vader, but being interrogated by Anakin Skywalker was uncomfortable, was her point. Isn't it a conflict of interest for you to be questioning the woman who corrupted your son? Mara asked, kind of wishing she could kick her feet up on the table for maximum abrasive casualness. But sadly they were cuffed to the chair. You're a Jedi, you're big on those ethical quandary things, right? Skywalker actually snarled at her in response. Shut up, Sith. I thought the whole point of this exercise was that you wanted me to talk. Only if you're going to tell me how you all managed to throw yourselves back into the past, he said, glaring. That was the one big difference between talking to Skywalker and talking to Vader. Skywalker actually had facial expressions that were easier to read than the typical dataput. You sure about that? Mara asked, smirking. Because I can tell you so many other things, like how your son screamed as I tore down his shields, ground them to dust, and ravaged his mind. Skywalker's fists clenched on the table, or rather, one of his hands clenched into a fist, the other froze, trembling with anger, into an open and claw-like position. Be glad I'm not allowed to hurt you, Skywalker growled, because you have no idea how tempted I am. Frankly, Mara wasn't sure that Luke's provoke Anakin Skywalker into realizing he's in danger of falling before he actually does plan would actually work. The details, admittedly, had been sparse. The plan hastily communicated to her between discreet handsins and carefully whispered asides in the depth of night. And she wasn't sure it wouldn't just push Anakin Skywalker that much closer to being Vader, but their options were limited. That didn't mean her choice to push the plan so hard in an unsupervised interrogation was the smartest thing she'd ever done. She let a little bit of her caution show. Let Skywalker think she was intimidated by him. In a careful show of not quite scared acquiescence, she ground out, we didn't throw ourselves back into the past on purpose, obviously. Since we had no idea what was going on and were immediately caught by you. Her act seemed to work. Skywalker didn't soften, precisely, but his anger didn't escalate again either. His open hand tightened into a normal fist. Inwardly, she sneered. She had spent the first 20 years of her life in service of a Sith Lord far more powerful and cunning than Vader would ever manage. If she could survive her former master sending her to spy on Vader at the height of his power, she could make it through one measly interrogation with Vader's light side self. Mara had always been an unparalleled spy. Sidious had kept her around for a reason, and Skywalker seemed to have even less ability to spot deception than Vader did. So what? You were just standing there, and boom, you're in the past. Well, we were standing in the courtyard of an abandoned Sith temple, but yes, Skywalker's eyes narrowed. The Sith temple you stayed on the grounds of while torturing my son. Mara narrowed her eyes in return. Yes, at length. Skywalker leaned in, starting to raise one of his hands, the one that had just seconds before been poised to strangle someone. Mara resisted the urge to swallow. She could still breathe. So far. She didn't need to prove it to herself. You know, Skywalker said, tone dark and relishing in the just visible hint of her reaction. These interrogations aren't being recorded. Most of them are observed, but none of them are recorded, and today the Jedi are busy. His smirk promised pain. If you happened to get loose, and I had to kill you, every single Jedi would believe it. Had Vader's face ever looked like that, under the mask? Mara hated to admit that she'd miscalculated. She always had. In the presence of the other Jedi, Vader had kept his demeanor reasonable, his aggression throttled down. But it was 6 months to Empire Day, and clearly Vader was closer to his fall than she and Luke had known. Luke's plan to get Skywalker to see how far he'd already fallen was too much of a risk. It was too much of a risk because there was a fair likelihood that Skywalker already knew. And even if he didn't, the man had far too much arrogance. It was an open question whether he'd be willing to believe them about his future, especially given their circumstances. Mara made an executive decision. She refused to cede ground, but neither did she shift her body language to provoke him. Still, he couldn't believe that anything was too good to be true if she was going to succeed. Her performance needed to be perfect. I believe you, she said, carefully not mentioning the Sith-like nature of his threats. Either he already knew, or he'd escalate in defensiveness. Either way, no help to her. Skywalker seemed taken ever so slightly aback by her refusal to bluster. Perfect. Before he could gather himself, she continued, I believe you, and I don't want to die. So let me tell you something that's worth my life. Anger and wariness made for an odd mix on Skywalker's face. If this is a trick, or more about my son. It is about your son, Mara admitted. Tone slow and neutral, because Skywalker responded positively to people he perceived to be upfront about their intentions. And she needed every last shred of the benefit of the doubt she could get, but not like earlier. It's one of the best guarded secrets of the Sith. What? Some ancient secret torture method? The opposite, Mara said, before Skywalker's anger could escalate further. It's the secret weakness of the Sith. At that, Skywalker looked interested. Yeah? He asked, tone still hard and eyebrow raised. The most dire, most carefully guarded secret of the Sith is this, she said, staring intently into his eyes. Falls aren't permanent. You can still save him. Skywalker's eyes widened immensely before they narrowed again. You're lying. I'm not. The Sith master I served, in my future, had an apprentice. That apprentice cast off the dark side and returned to the light. Just how stupid do you think I am? I don't. Skywalker didn't appreciate being cut off. I don't, Mara said, before he could protest, and conveniently it was true. Vader had been a tactical genius, if uncaring of the more covert battlefields. This is the most closely guarded secret of the Sith, and for obvious reason, but it's true. If you hear me out, I can tell you how to save your son. Skywalker's gaze bore into her. And if I find out you're lying, hear me out, try to reach him, and if not, Mara shrugged, the motion making her binders clank together awkwardly. It's not like I'm going anywhere. The reminder that he could always come back and murder her later seemed to settle Skywalker. Mara found it more unnerving than she wanted to admit, which was to say, at all, but she also understood the feeling. Fine, Skywalker bit out, his tone almost mocking. Convince me. Mara took a deep breath. Then, she lied as convincingly as she ever had. Luke fell less than a week ago. He hasn't hurt anyone. Except Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and their feelings. But it would be prudent to leave that out. He hasn't killed anyone. He's barely channeled the dark side. Given that he was out of my force binders for all of 10 minutes before you showed up and put them back on. If he only channeled the dark side for 10 minutes, why is he like that? Luke had kept the worst of his posturing, of his threats, away from his father and Obi-Wan, but clearly they'd still heard. Probably because the cells had cameras and recording devices, even if the interrogation rooms did not, a fact which did not speak well of the more ancient Jedi Order. Mara kept her tone perfectly even. It was nice, for once, to have an excuse to not pretend to revel in her husband's supposed pain. He is scared and angry and traumatized. He's lashing out from those emotions, which fall into the patterns the dark side set within his mind and within his presence in the Force. Especially since I channeled the dark side through him as part of my efforts to turn him, setting those paths. But contrary to what the Sith have convinced the Jedi Order, a slight risk, but less of one than implying the Order was to blame for their own ignorance. Falling is a choice. Using the dark side is a choice. One that blinds you to all other options, yes, and one that's far too easy to make. But it is still possible for Luke to choose otherwise. You're saying, Anakin said through gritted teeth, that my son just has to choose to return to the light side, and he can. Mara shrugged, because he'd lash out if he thought she was trying too hard to win him over. It's not easy, but yes, he can. He just to realize that he has a choice. And receive enough support after what he's been through to be able to make that choice. After what you put him through. Mara inclined her chin. Yes, after what I put him through. Skywalker wasn't entirely wrong. If this got Luke transferred to a separate cell, away from the rest of them, he would not be happy. Mara might be, though. Luke had been through enough already. He didn't deserve to have to be around his cellmates, around the reminders of his trauma, any longer. It was a long time before Skywalker spoke again. If you're telling the truth, I want specifics. How to help him. I'm not a mind healer. Skywalker leaned forward, started to open his mouth. Mara sighed. You usually interrogate me, because the obvious conflict of interest is even greater with your son. Next time, don't talk to him. Don't push too hard. Just try to get to know him. You don't even need the front of the interrogation. He knows you're his father. Your reasons will be believable. So give him a break. Be the first person in weeks that has been kind to him, that isn't trying to force him into anything. Skywalker leaned back in his seat. He drummed his gloved fingers on the table. Finally, he answered, fine. I'll try it. But if you're lying to me, we are going to have another conversation. Keep in mind, change won't be immediate, Mara cautioned. But I swear, I'm not lying to you. Skywalker escorted her back to her cell in silence. She pretended not to notice the long, assessing, longing stare he gave Luke on the way out. Maybe if they were lucky, she hadn't only bought herself more time, Maybe Anakin Skywalker knowing he could return to the light would enable him to do so much sooner. Without knowing how he fell, they had no way to know. But first, she had to inform Luke that there was a change of plans. You what? Luke thought. But, of course, Mara couldn't hear him. I already told you why I did it, farm boy, so you can stop freaking out. Even completely unable to hear him, Mara still knew what he was thinking. They understood each other like that. So, you know, when he shows up tomorrow, be prepared. And please give him at least moderate encouragement, or my life is about to get much more complicated. Yeah, Luke hadn't exactly had his father genuinely threatening to murder his imprisoned wife on the list of things he would have expected out of a trip to the past. Mara raised her mental shields after that, not ones reinforced by the Force, but the natural shielding that any sentient developed over time. Even without the Force, she was one of the few people with shields strong enough that Luke probably couldn't have broken them if he'd wanted to. About 5 minutes later, the shields folded again, presumably once Mara had mustered her thoughts. He's further gone than we thought, probably further than he realizes. But I don't think he's too far gone for you to reach, presumably, given that 20 years of tyranny and genocide hadn't left Anakin Skywalker too far gone for Luke to reach. And I think getting the chance to save his son could be the perfect incentive for him to look a little more toward the light. Luke could only hope. Ben, his first teacher, his mentor, a man who had been put through the pain of watching Anakin Skywalker fall, and now was seeing his second student fallen instead. If being interrogated by his father had been, or being held captive on his father's ship while pretending to be evil, doing all of that with Ben had been so much worse. So, Luke Skywalker, I don't suppose you feel like telling me how old you are, or how old your father was when he had you. He had to act evil to a younger Ben. That was great. Really, really great. Terrific. He could totally do that. No issues at all. Managing a Vader impression wasn't something Luke could do with his facial expressions, for obvious reasons, but he decided a smirk was a nice, neutral option. I was born the day the Republic died. And what day was that, exactly? Wouldn't you like to know? Yes, I would, why I just asked you. But since you're apparently not willing to answer that, how about your age? Or we can move on to the course of events in the galaxy, but I thought you might prefer to start here. Why not? Surely he wasn't expected to fight Obi-Wan on every single point, probably. But he let none of his debate appear in voice and just shrugged. I'm 35. Actually, Obi-Wan also looked around 35, and wasn't that a trip and a half? Obi-Wan Kenobi was his peer. When did you establish the new Jedi Order? Back when I was weak and pathetic enough to think the Jedi should exist. And Darth Vection changed your mind. Yes. Luke said with a zealot's smile, one lit with a mad worshipfulness that painfully distorted the love he felt toward his wife. Lord Vection showed me the darkness. She saved me from an eternity of misery, of my absurd, endless attempts to help other people. She showed me the true way that we could only help the galaxy by ruling it. And by making sure the Jedi Order dies once more. So you intended to reenact this supposed fall of the Jedi. I intend to massacre them. I intend to set fire to my own temple and douse the flames with the blood of my students. Only then will the galaxy be cleansed. Luke kind of wanted to vomit. The fact that he was ripping rhetoric from Darth Vader and the old propaganda videos of the Empire only made it worse. And yet only 2 weeks ago, you claim you were loyal to the Order, to the light. Is Vection really so powerful that she could make you fall so far, and not even blame her for it? You underestimate her power, Luke said, and because the best way to channel Darth Vader was to actually quote him, and you underestimate the power of the dark side.